It sounds like something out of a horror film. A royal funeral where dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people are forced to die. Not from disease, not from war, but by deliberate, ceremonial slaughter. Servants, guards, wives, concubines, buried alive, their muffled screams swallowed by the earth as tombs are sealed for eternity. And here's the most disturbing part. They weren't running. They weren't fighting. Many of them smiled as they stepped into death. From the grasslands of ancient China to the deserts of Mesopotamia, this macabre ritual was not just accepted, it was celebrated. Killing the living to serve the dead wasn't considered crime. It was an honor, a sacrée tradition, a royal duty. But behind the masks of loyalty and spiritual devotion lies a much darker truth. These weren't just rituals. They were warnings, power plays, a final, chilling statement from kings who demanded control, even from beyond the grave. So, why did entire civilizations normalize this? Why did so many go willingly? And what kind of king smiles as his servants are slaughtered? To find the answers, we'll have to dig deep into ancient tombs, forbidden texts, and the darkest psychology of power. This is not just a story about history. It's a story about control, fear, and the ultimate price of loyalty. Welcome to the death cult of kings. They weren't discovered by accident. Archaeologists had long suspected that ancient kings didn't die alone. Legend spoke of burial chambers so vast they could rival palaces, lined not just with golden artifacts, but with bodies. Not skeletons thrown together in haste, like victims of war or plague. These bodies were positioned with care, arms folded, eyes closed, sometimes even smiling. It was in the 20th century, in the vast burial mounds of ancient China's Shang Dynasty, that the truth began to surface, literally. Hundreds of human remains were unearthed, each buried alongside their king in death, and yet clearly prepared for the moment. Many were young, healthy. Some were women. Others were warriors. And all had been dead for only one reason. Their king had died. But it didn't stop there. In Mesopotamia, at the royal cemetery of Uar, dating back over 4,500 years, archaeologists found something eerily similar. Dozens of bodies arranged in formation, some still adorned with jewelry, instruments, or weapons. Inside one tomb, 6 soldiers lay in perfect alignment, guarding their deceased queen as if still on duty. Their skulls showed no trauma. Their bones bore no resistance. They hadn't been executed with brutality. They had entered willingly, or so it seemed. The practice was called retainer sacrifice, a tradition in which kings and nobles were buried with members of their household, their guards, their musicians, even their wives. The idea was spiritual. These retainers would serve their ruler in the afterlife, just as they did in life. It was, according to custom, a sacred privilege. But the evidence started to whisper something different. In UR, a closer look at the skulls revealed a chilling clue. Many had traces of blunt force trauma or chemical poisoning. Some had crushed vertebrae. Others were doused in mercury or toxic herbs. What was once believed to be voluntary sacrifice was, in many cases, systematic slaughter. Even more disturbing, the victims weren't all adults. In ancient Egypt, in the first dynasty tomb of Pharaoh Aha, archaeologists found remains of dozens of young attendants, some no older than 12, buried in separate chambers, but all sealed at the same time as the king. Experts believe they were killed or buried alive to accompany their pharaoh into eternity. This wasn't culture. This was control. Tombs became silent monuments to a ruler's absolute power, not just in life, but beyond death. In some societies, these kings were viewed as gods, and to disobey a god's posthumous command was unthinkable. Worse than betrayal, it was heresy. But what kind of system convinces people, not just to accept this fate, but to embrace it? Why did so many step willingly into these tombs? Were they manipulated? Brainwashed? Threatened? Or was something even deeper at play? They didn't scream. They didn't run. They didn't beg for their lives. Some are even smiling. That's the image that still haunts archaeologists who uncover these mass sacrificial burials. Not the violence, but the calm. The order. the eerie serenity of people who seem to accept their deaths with quiet dignity. But why? What could make a person willingly walk into a tomb, lie beside a corpse, and let the earth close in over them? The truth is more disturbing than we want to believe. In ancient Sumer, records show that the servants and guards chosen for retainer sacrifice were often given wine mixed with opiates, intoxicating their minds and dulling their fear. In the royal tombs of Ur, scientists found residues of such potions in golden cups buried with the dead. It wasn't just a religious ritual. It was pharmacological submission. These people weren't volunteers. They were prepared, mentally, physically, spiritually, for a death they might never have chosen sober. But not all were drugged. In some regions of China and Africa, the practice of live burial was embedded in the culture so deeply, people believed it was the highest honor. Servants were raised from birth in royal households, taught that dying with their king was not only expected, but sacred. Their identity was entirely tied to their loyalty. And in a world where the afterlife mirrored the living world, to serve your king beyond death was to continue your purpose. This is where belief became bondage. For many, the idea of dying for the king was no more horrifying than a modern soldier dying in battle. It was a duty, a destiny, and in societies ruled by divine kings, believed to be descendants of gods, refusal wasn't just rebellion. It was damnation. But not everyone accepted their fate. In the ancient Korean kingdom of Silla, royal retainers were buried alive with their rulers. However, historical texts record several chilling incidents. Servants attempting to flee the burial grounds, some screaming and resisting as they were dragged into the tombs. These moments, though rare in official accounts, paint a picture that shatters the myth of total devotion. There was fear, desperation, and behind the smiles, there was suffering. Sometimes the smiles were forced. In ancient Egypt, court artists and stoneworkers carved images of retainers with serene expressions, kneeling beside their pharaoh. But what's carved in stone doesn't always match reality. Beneath those tombs, skeletons tell a different story. Bound wrists, crushed rib cages, shallow graves filled hastily before the stone was set. It wasn't just loyalty. It was propaganda. Rulers wanted to be remembered not only as powerful in life, but worshipped in death. A king whose servants died, smiling seemed loved, revered, eternal. But the smile could hide a multitude of sins. And then there were the concubines. In China's Shang Dynasty, royal concubines were often buried alive in chambers around the emperor's tomb. Some were stabbed, others poisoned. A few archaeologists believe were sealed in with food and water, left to die slowly in the dark. Why? Because the emperor might need them later. And when a man believes he is a god, the cruelty becomes divine. The smiling sacrifice wasn't just a ritual. It was a symbol, a way to immortalize the ruler's power and erase the voices of the unwilling. But the greatest manipulation of all was still to come, because some kings didn't just expect loyalty in death. They commanded it with supernatural terror. You might think that death ends a king's rule. But in ancient civilizations, death was often just the beginning. These weren't men who relinquished power at the grave. They were kings, emperors, pharaohs, self-proclaimed gods whose authority bled into the afterlife. Their commands didn't expire with their last breath. They echoed into eternity, written in stone, carved in gold, and sealed with blood. And the most terrifying command of all? Join me. In ancient China, during the rule of the Qin and Shang dynasties, this posthumous control took horrifying forms. The first emperor of Qin, Qin Shi Huang, was buried in one of the most elaborate tombs in history, surrounded by the famous terracotta army. But many believe these clay warriors were placed in even darker tradition, human sacrifice. Earlier dynasties buried living guards, generals, and craftsmen to serve their emperor forever. In some tombs, workers who helped build the chambers were sealed inside once the tomb was complete, buried alive, so they couldn't reveal its secrets. Their final task was their own tomb, their silence permanent. This was the king's final command, loyalty beyond life, secrets to the grave. In the Akkadian Empire of Mesopotamia, royal inscriptions described the eternal household, a concept where kings expected their servants and soldiers to continue their duties in the afterlife. To defy this command was to defy a god. Punishment wasn't just death, it was eternal damnation. The fear wasn't only physical, it was metaphysical. Obey, or be cursed forever. Some kings weaponized religion itself. Egyptian pharaohs, who were considered living gods, infused their burial rituals with terror. Inscriptions inside tombs warned of divine wrath for those who disturbed or disobeyed the royal journey to the afterlife. Retainers were chosen, often very young, and told that to die with their pharaoh was not just duty, but salvation. To live on without him? Spiritual annihilation. It was spiritual extortion. The manipulation was masterful. Fear wrapped in faith. Obedience masked as devotion. Death repackaged as honor. And yet, the psychological control didn't stop with servants. It extended to entire civilizations. In the West African kingdom of Dahomey, kings were buried with dozens of wives, soldiers, and officials. The practice was known as retainer sacrifice, but there was nothing passive about it. Victims were sometimes strangled, sometimes stabbed, sometimes locked in tombs with no air. And while the world now recoils at such brutality, in Dahomey, it was law, custom, culture. The king's will transcended death. His command, irreversible. To refuse was treason. To accept was glorified suicide. What's most chilling is how these commands became generational. Children were raised in palaces knowing that their destiny was to die beside their king. Families saw it as an honor to be chosen. Propaganda ran deep. Myths were told of servants granted paradise, of queens who danced eternally with their gods, of warriors still fighting beside their king in the afterlife. But not all kings were content with just their own death rites. Some extended their control further into cities, villages, entire nations. When a Maya ruler died, mass ceremonies were held to mark his passage into the underworld. Human sacrifices weren't limited to servants. They included slaves, prisoners, even members of the royal bloodline. The king's transition became a public spectacle of dominance, reminding the living who held the power, even in death. This wasn't about spiritual tradition. It was about eternal fear. And fear, as history has shown time and time again, is the most effective way to keep a crown intact, even when the king has rotted to dust. But these horrifying practices weren't just about power. They were also about appeasement, because in many ancient cultures, it wasn't the king demanding the blood. It was the gods. Power can explain many things. Fear, even more. But in some cultures, the reason for retainer sacrifice went beyond the will of the king. It was the will of the gods. And when gods demand blood, no one is safe. In ancient Mesoamerica, the Maya, Aztec, and earlier Olmec civilizations practiced human sacrifice at a terrifying scale. While much of it was aimed at appeasing deities directly, rain gods, sun gods, death gods, sacrifices also took place during royal funerals. The deceased were not simply buried. They were accompanied by priests, slaves, warriors, concubines, offered as divine escorts to help guide the soul of the ruler into the afterlife. It wasn't always seen as violence. It was a spiritual transaction, a cosmic bargain, but the details were gruesome. Victims would be drugged, painted, and dressed in ceremonial robes before being marched up stone steps. Their chests sliced open, hearts torn out, bodies thrown down temple stairs. And all of it performed before massive crowds, celebrated, not condemned. To die in this way was believed to purify the soul, to serve a divine purpose, and in the case of a deceased king, to protect his passage to the next world. This wasn't about loyalty anymore. It was about divine necessity. In India, during certain periods of early Hinduism, a now outlawed practice known as sati emerged. When a high-caste man died, his widow was expected, sometimes pressured, sometimes forced, to throw herself onto his funeral pyre, burned alive beside his corpse. This ritual was seen as the ultimate act of devotion. A woman who refused might be shunned, accused of impiety, or even punished. While not widespread or uniform across India's long and complex history, Sati reflected a belief that a wife's role did not end with her husband's life. It was eternal. And behind that belief, religion, culture, and control. But perhaps nowhere was divine justification more haunting than in ancient Egypt. The pharaohs weren't just kings, they were gods on earth. And when a god died, balance had to be restored. Ma'at, the divine order of the universe, required harmony. Ritual death became a mechanism to maintain that balance. Retainers were killed not just for the king's benefit, but for the world's survival. To question the ritual was to invite chaos. To resist, it was to defy the divine. Even in Europe, echoes of this belief existed. In the Nordic world, Viking chieftains and kings were sometimes buried with thralls. Enslaved people sacrificed during elaborate funeral rites. According to the Arab chronicler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who witnessed such a funeral in the 10th century, a female slave was chosen to accompany the dead chieftain. She was made to drink, sing, and sleep with various men, then stabbed and strangled before being placed beside the body of her master in a burning ship. The ritual wasn't just symbolic. It was mythological, a journey to Valhalla, paid for in blood. But the danger in all of these examples isn't just the ritual itself. It's what happens when belief overrides humanity. When killing becomes sacred. When suffering becomes a sacrament. When cruelty becomes divine. This is the darkest edge of religion. The line where worship blurs into terror. And while many of these practices eventually vanished, they left behind a troubling legacy. One that still lingers in surprising ways. Because even as these death cults crumbled, the idea never truly died. For thousands of years, kings ruled not just with armies, but with graves. And for just as long, entire societies accepted that their rulers' power should extend into the afterlife. But eventually, something changed. The walls of the tombs began to crack. Not just physically, but spiritually. The death cults started to fall. In ancient China, the brutal practice of retainer sacrifice largely disappeared after the fall of the Shang Dynasty. By the time of the Han Dynasty, burials became more symbolic. Servants were replaced by statues, dolls, or inscriptions. The concept of loyalty beyond death remained, but the bloodshed was gone. Why? Part of it was political. New dynasties needed to distance themselves from the atrocities of their predecessors. And as philosophical systems like Confucianism gained influence, the value of human life and orderly moral governance clashed with the old rituals of death. But it wasn't morality alone that ended the killing. It was pragmatism. Killing hundreds of healthy young citizens to honor a dead king was bad for business. Armies were weakened, labor forces drained, families destroyed. As empires expanded and became more complex, death cults were no longer efficient. In Mesopotamia, similar transitions occurred. The lavish, bloody burials of the early dynasties faded as cities grew more interdependent and religions became more sophisticated. Gods no longer demanded entire retinues of the dead. Offerings became symbolic: gold, food, art. Human life gained value not just spiritually, but economically. In Egypt, too, the change was slow but decisive. While early dynasties engaged in human sacrifice and mass burials, later rulers favored eternal servants made of stone, ushabtis, small figurines that would come to life in the afterworld and perform tasks for the pharaoh. A clever substitution that preserved the illusion of control without the blood. And then there were the revolts. Not everyone accepted death so easily. In West Africa, during the decline of the Dahomey Kingdom, records tell of growing resistance among the people, of women refusing to give up their daughters, of warriors fleeing royal summons, of whispers that the gods no longer needed bodies, only belief. Resistance became revolution. Colonial forces, for all their own brutal legacies, often outlawed human sacrifice where they found it, citing moral and religious reasons. While this was frequently a tool of control and not compassion, the outcome was the same: Ancient traditions were crushed under the weight of modernity. And yet, the echoes remain. In some cultures, symbolic forms of retainer sacrifice still exist. Loyalty pledges, blood oaths, suicide cults. In North Korea, high-ranking officials are sometimes executed alongside disgraced leaders, publicly and ceremonially. In extremist movements around the world, leaders still demand death as proof of loyalty. And in the minds of the most dangerous individuals, the idea persists that a leader's power should never die, that loyalty must be proven in blood, that the grave is just another throne. We no longer build tombs with screaming servants. We build them with silence, with obedience, with myths of sacrifice dressed as honor. But the lesson is as clear today as it was 4,000 years ago, when a ruler demands not just your life, but your death. It's no longer a kingdom. It's a cult. And history shows us exactly how those end. We often look at ancient history with a sense of detachment, marveling at the pyramids, the tombs, the ceremonial texts, forgetting the screams buried beneath the stones. But behind every magnificent grave is a darker truth. Behind every sacred ritual, a silent coercion. Behind every smiling servant, a story of power taken to the grave. These were not just customs. They were calculated performances of dominance, rooted in fear, mysticism, and absolute control. Kings who ruled in life demanded worship in death, and their people, drugged, indoctrinated, or simply terrified, obeyed. It's easy to believe those days are long gone. But history has a way of repeating itself, not in the same form, but in the same patterns. Cult-like loyalty, blind obedience, leaders who demand everything, even when they've given nothing. So maybe the tombs are still with us, just made of glass and gold now, instead of stone and blood. If this story unsettled you good, it should. If you want more dark truth from history, the stories you're not taught in school, subscribe now. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this video with someone who thinks ancient history is boring. And if you think the past can't haunt the present, just wait. Another shocking story is only one click away.